Nobody heard it coming. That is the point. That has always been the point. Somewhere beneath the surface of the Indian Ocean, approximately 40 nautical miles south of the coast of Sri Lanka, a United States Navy submarine was running silent. No active sonar, no surface contact. No visible signature of any kind. Just a machine designed by the most advanced naval engineering program in human history to be, for all practical purposes, non-existent. And it had been tracking the IRIS Dena for days. The Iranian frigate had no idea it was being followed. Why would it? The IRIS Dena had just completed a goodwill tour. It had participated in the International Fleet Review in India. It had waved its flag, shaken hands with admirals from 12 nations, and turned its bow toward home. Iran's state media had covered the deployment extensively, a carefully managed signal to the world that the Islamic Republic remained a capable naval power, a legitimate actor in international waters, a country that could project presence across oceans while the bombs were falling on its territory. The optics were deliberate, and the message was clear. It was the last message the IRIS Dena would ever send. To understand what happened in the pre-dawn darkness of March 4th, 2026, you have to understand what the previous 72 hours had already done to the strategic landscape of this conflict. US and Israeli strikes had been hitting Iranian territory for 4 consecutive days. Senior Iranian officials were dead, including figures whose names had appeared on American targeting lists for years. Nuclear facilities that Iran had spent decades and billions hardening were being systematically reduced to rubble. Iran's Air Force, for all its limitations, was engaging. Its proxy networks across Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen were activated and firing. The conflict had crossed thresholds that military analysts had spent years treating as theoretical red lines. None of them were theoretical anymore. And in the middle of all of it, an Iranian naval frigate was sailing home through the Indian Ocean, slow and proud and fundamentally alone, 4,000 miles from the nearest Iranian port. The IRIS Dena was not a symbol of Iran's most dangerous military capabilities. She was a Mauj-class frigate, domestically designed and domestically built, displacing roughly 1,500 tons, carrying anti-ship missiles and torpedo tubes, and a crew of approximately 140 sailors who had spent weeks representing their country at a peacetime naval exercise. She was not a major strategic threat in the way that an Iranian ballistic missile battery is a threat, or in the way that a Shahab missile is a threat. She was a warship, sovereign Iranian military property, sailing in international waters, heading home. That distinction, in the context of a live shooting war between the United States and Iran, no longer carried the weight it might have carried 2 weeks earlier. What the crew of the IRIS Dena did not know, could not have known, was that the submarine tracking them had been in position before the shooting started. United States Navy submarine operations in the Indian Ocean are not improvised. They are planned months in advance, refined continuously, and executed with the kind of institutional patience that does not announce itself. The Virginia-class attack submarines that represent the backbone of America's underwater fleet can sustain operations for months without surfacing. Their sonar systems can detect and track surface targets at ranges that would seem implausible to anyone who has not studied the acoustic physics involved, and they do not need to be close to be lethal. The authorization to fire did not come until the 4th day of the conflict. That timing is not incidental. It tells you something important about the decision-making architecture behind this strike. This was not a spontaneous reaction. It was not a commander in the field making a judgment call. A decision to sink a foreign nation's naval vessel in international waters, 4,000 miles from the primary theater of conflict, in waters where a dozen other countries' navies were present, required authorization at a level that goes all the way to the top of the chain of command. The deliberate timing, coming 4 days into the conflict after multiple thresholds had already been crossed, suggests that this strike was planned as an escalation option to be exercised at a moment of strategic choice, not tactical opportunity. Someone in Washington decided that the moment had arrived. At dawn on March 4th, the IRIS Dena was running on a northwesterly heading, making standard transit speed, her crew cycling through morning watches. The Sri Lanka Navy would later describe receiving a distress signal. The signal itself is a data point worth sitting with. A distress signal means there was time to transmit. A distress signal means the ship did not simply cease to exist in an instant, but took on water, listed, and went down over a span of time long enough for radio operators to reach their equipment and send a call. The Sri Lanka Air Force launched search and rescue aircraft. The Sri Lanka Navy dispatched vessels. 32 crew members were pulled from the water and transported to the Karapitiya Teaching Hospital in Gale for treatment of blast injuries and exhaustion. The rest of the approximately 140 aboard did not come home. That number deserves acknowledgement before we go any further. Whatever the strategic calculus involved, whatever the legal framework cited, whatever the military logic that drove this decision, somewhere between 100 and 110 Iranian sailors went into the Indian Ocean on the morning of March 4th and did not come back up. They were not admirals. They were not strategic planners. They were not the men who designed Iran's nuclear program or the commanders who ordered drone strikes on American bases. They were sailors who had been attending a naval exercise in India. The gap between their mission and their fate is not a comfortable thing to look at directly, and the analysis that follows should not be mistaken for indifference to it. Now, let's look at what this strike actually means strategically, because the implications extend well beyond the Indian Ocean. The first and most immediate question is the legal and precedent question. The IRIS Dena was a commissioned warship of a sovereign nation, sailing in international waters far from any declared exclusion zone, not engaged in any hostile action at the time of the strike. The United States and Iran are, as of this moment, in an active state of armed conflict, following direct U.S. strikes on Iranian territory. Under the laws of armed conflict, once two nations are in a state of war, the military assets of each are legitimate targets for the other. That is the American legal position, and it is not an unreasonable interpretation of the applicable framework. Iran's position, delivered with predictable fury through every available diplomatic channel, is that the Dena was on a peacetime mission, that she had just participated in a multilateral exercise, that she posed no threat to any American vessel or personnel, and that her destruction constitutes a war crime. Both of these positions will be argued in various international forums for years. What cannot be argued is the message the strike sends, not to Iran specifically, but to every naval power watching this conflict unfold. The message is this: once the shooting starts, the submarine is already there. The Virginia-class boat that sank the Dena had been trailing her for days without her knowledge. Her crew had no indication they were being tracked. Her captain had no reason to believe he was sailing into a threat envelope. And yet, the moment authorization came, the outcome was never in question. This is the most psychologically devastating aspect of submarine warfare that surface sailors spend careers trying not to think about too carefully. The threat is invisible. The decision to pull the trigger has already been made before the target ever knows it is a target. For the Iranian Navy, this is not an abstract lesson. It is now a lived reality, transmitted through 32 survivors who woke up in a Sri Lankan hospital and who will spend the rest of their lives with the specific knowledge of what it feels like when the sea comes in without warning. Let us now talk about what Iran has and what Iran does not have in terms of response options. Iran's naval doctrine was built around the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. Its asymmetric capabilities, the fast attack boats, the anti-ship missiles, the mining capability, the swarm tactics that have kept American naval planners up at night for 2 decades. All of that architecture is designed for a specific geographic context: the confined, shallow, strategically vital waters of the Gulf, where the geometry compresses, ranges, and favors the defender. In that environment, Iran can credibly threaten surface ships in ways that demand serious military respect. The Indian Ocean is not that environment. In the Indian Ocean, Iran has no submarines capable of threatening American naval vessels. It has no airborne maritime patrol capability that can range 4,000 miles from its coastline. It has no surface combatants currently positioned anywhere near the waters where the Dena was sunk. The IRIS Dena was isolated not just tactically, but strategically, which is precisely why she was vulnerable and precisely why she was chosen. The decision to strike her, 4,000 miles from the nearest Iranian airbase, says something deliberate about American intentions. It says that Iranian military assets do not have a safe zone simply because they are far from the primary theater. It says that the conflict's geographic boundaries are defined by American decision-making, not by Iranian positioning. The strategic logic behind that message is cold and clear. If every Iranian warship in international waters is now a potential target, then Iran's ability to project even symbolic naval presence anywhere in the world has been neutralized. The goodwill tour that the Dena was completing, the flag waving at multinational exercises, the careful signaling that Iran remained a participant in the international naval community, despite the bombs falling on its territory, that entire diplomatic and symbolic effort dies in the water along with the ship. Tehran's domestic political challenge in the wake of this strike is genuinely complicated. The Iranian government had been running a careful information operation, presenting the ongoing conflict as American aggression that Iran was heroically withstanding, pointing to the Dena's peaceful mission as evidence that Iran was the reasonable party, the one seeking diplomacy, while the great Satan rained bombs on schoolgirls in Minab. That narrative, fragile as it was, had some genuine traction. The images from the Dena's India visit, Iranian sailors photographed alongside their counterparts from a dozen nations, were exactly the kind of imagery the regime wanted circulating. Those images now sit next to a distress signal and 32 survivors in a Sri Lankan hospital, and the Iranian propaganda machine must decide what story to tell its population about a warship it had publicly celebrated that is now on the bottom of the Indian Ocean. The response from Tehran came in the language Tehran has used for every escalation of this conflict: threats of retaliation, promises that America would pay a price, invocations of the Supreme Leader's guidance. The practical content of any possible retaliation in the Indian Ocean theater is, as described above, essentially zero. What Iran can do in response is what it has already been doing in the theaters where it does have assets: more missile salvos toward U.S. bases in the region, more drone launches through proxy networks, more pressure on the Strait of Hormuz, more activation of whatever Hezbollah capabilities remain functional after the pounding Lebanon has been absorbing. The escalation ladder, in other words, has nowhere left to climb except in directions that hurt Iran far more than they hurt the United States. There is a harder question lurking beneath all of this that the triumphalist coverage tends to skip past. The sinking of the Dena happened 40 miles off the coast of Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka, a country that has nothing to do with this conflict, that was attempting to conduct a humanitarian search and rescue operation for sailors who sent a distress signal in its waters. The Sri Lanka Navy scrambled, the Sri Lanka Air Force deployed, and they arrived to find wreckage. That is what the expansion of this conflict looks like to the nations caught in its radius. A warship sinking in your coastal waters after an exercise your Navy participated in, with survivors being taken to your hospitals, and no one asking your permission. India, which hosted the exercise the Dena was returning from, has a relationship with both Iran and the United States that this incident has just made dramatically more uncomfortable. Delhi's careful neutrality, its tradition of strategic autonomy, its long-running refusal to take sides in American-led coalition operations, all of that is now under pressure from the simple geographic fact that the last friendly port the Dena visited was Visakhapatnam, and the last international event she attended was one where Indian admirals shook hands with her captain. China is doing arithmetic it would prefer not to be doing. 40% of Chinese oil imports transit from the Gulf region. The Strait of Hormuz, already under the pressure of this conflict, remains open for now, but is not guaranteed to stay that way. A Chinese naval frigate is roughly as vulnerable to a Virginia-class submarine as an Iranian one is. That calculation does not require Chinese leadership to be aggressive to feel threatening. It requires only that they sit with the knowledge that the underwater domain, which China has been investing in heavily, is still one in which American capability exceeds their own by a margin that this week's events have just made viscerally concrete. Russia is watching, as Russia always watches, through the lens of a nation that has been bleeding in Ukraine for 4 years and is calculating whether an American military so deeply committed to this Middle Eastern campaign can remain simultaneously focused on European deterrence. The answer is probably yes in the short term. The American military is large enough to conduct multiple theater operations simultaneously, but it is not infinite. And every tomahawk fired at an Iranian coastal battery is a tomahawk not in the magazine when some future crisis in some other theater demands it. Back in the Indian Ocean, the Sri Lanka Navy has suspended its search and rescue operation. 32 men are alive who, by the margin of a few seconds and the angle of a torpedo's entry, might not be. The IRIS Dena, whose crew spent weeks sailing under Iranian colors at peaceful international exercises, is in roughly 1,500 meters of water off the southern coast of a country that never asked to be part of this. And somewhere beneath those same waters, running silent, running dark, a United States Navy submarine is already on its next assignment. The war that started with 120 American aircraft repositioning toward the Middle East has now extended its reach to the Indian Ocean. It has crossed into the waters where the international naval community gathers for exercises and handshakes and carefully choreographed images of a world that is not yet at war. That world ended on the morning of March 4th. The torpedo that sank the IRIS Dena did not just sink a ship. It announced the geographic scope of this conflict to every naval power on Earth. It drew the boundary not around the Strait of Hormuz, not around the Persian Gulf, not around the Middle East, but around every Iranian military asset, wherever it is, wherever it sails, whatever flag-waving mission it is completing, for as long as this conflict lasts. The only question worth asking now is the same question that applied on the day the first American bomb fell on Iranian soil. Not whether American power can reach. Clearly it can. Clearly it has. The question is, what comes next? What the world looks like when the last bomb falls. What Iran does with the humiliation of a warship sunk 4,000 miles from home, in waters where it had just been welcomed as a guest. What the 32 survivors tell their grandchildren about the morning the sea came in. The submarine heard nothing. That is the point. That has always been the point. What no one has fully answered yet is what the silence costs.